Speak up, Miss Voss. Or have you forgotten how? Laughter cracked across the York assizes like breaking glass. Mr. Reginald Whitmore stood at the witness rail in a gray silk waistcoat, one hand resting on the polished wood like he owned the courtroom too. He had already testified for 40 minutes. He had wept, on cue, twice. He had called his cousin Julian a broken man I still love in a voice built for effect. Now Sir Nathaniel Quayle rose for the defense. The defense calls Miss Tessa Voss. Silence. Then a ripple. Then open laughter from the gallery. The mute? He's calling the mute. A man in the second row slapped his knee. A woman in furs pressed a gloved hand to her mouth, delighted. Reginald laughed loudest of all, head thrown back, gold watch chain catching the light. Duke Julian Whitmore sat in the dock, hands cuffed in his lap, and did not laugh. He watched a maid in a plain gray dress rise from the back bench where servants were made to sit. She had scrubbed his floors for 6 years, poured his tea, never once spoken a word in his hearing. She walked the length of the courtroom. Her boots were quiet on the stone. The laughter followed her, mocking, delighted, cruel. And then it did not. Because Tessa Voss reached the witness stand, laid one hand on the rail, lifted her chin, and spoke in a voice the entire household of Whitmore House had never once heard. My name is Tessa Voss. I have heard everything. The laughter died like a string cut clean. A woman in the gallery gasped, and the gasp ran down the row like a lit fuse. Reginald's smile did not move for a full second, frozen, painted on, wrong. Somewhere near the back, a barrister's clerk dropped his pen and it rang against the floor like a small bell tolling. For 6 years they had spoken every secret in front of her. The forged letters, the bribed clerk, the plot to bury a duke. They had called her furniture. Furniture was about to speak. Before we continue, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time you saw this video. Tonight's story is one you will never forget. Rewind 6 years. Spring 1905. Whitmore House stood gray and enormous under a sky the color of wet stone. 300 windows and not one of them warm yet, because the fires had not been lit, because the new maid had not yet learned where the coal was kept. Tessa Voss stood in the servants' hall with a small case and a letter of reference that lied about her past in every line except her name. Mrs. Harriet Binns, the housekeeper, looked her up and down once. "You don't speak," she said. "Not a question." Tessa shook her head. "Good," said a voice from the doorway. Mr. Reginald Whitmore leaned against the frame in riding clothes, mud still on his boots, smiling the smile of a man who has never once been told no and believed it. "Hire her, Binns. A mute servant is worth 3 that talk. Speak freely in front of her. She's only a keyhole with hands." He laughed at his own joke. Nobody else did. Mrs. Binns did not laugh either, but she did not stop him. That was the first cruelty. It would not be the last, and it would not be the worst. And Tessa Voss stood in the hall and let the words land on her like rain on stone, because that was what 6 years of silence had taught her to do. She did not know yet that this house would ask her to be silent through worse than jokes. 2 months in, Reginald Whitmore discovered that a locked cellar of French wine was 3 bottles short. He summoned the 2 junior footmen, Danny Pratt and Owen Cole, into the library and accused them both, loudly, before the entire household staff lined up against the walls. "Thieves," Reginald said, "in my cousin's own house, under my cousin's own roof." Danny Pratt's face went the color of chalk. "Sir, I never touched the cellar. I swear it on my mother. Swear on whatever you like." Reginald's voice was silk over iron. "You are dismissed. Both of you. No character reference. Try finding work in this county now." Owen Cole started to cry, quietly, ashamed of it, wiping his face with the back of his hand. Tessa Voss stood at the end of the line with a coal scuttle in her hands and said nothing. She knew where the wine had gone. She had seen Reginald himself carry 3 bottles out to his own carriage 2 nights before, wrapped in a horse blanket, and she had written it down that same night in the small cipher notebook she carried against her ribs. A code only she could read, letters twisted into shapes like no alphabet on earth, a private language built from 6 years of a mouth that would not open. She could have spoken. One sentence would have saved 2 men their livelihoods. She did not. The door shut behind Danny Pratt and Owen Cole, and the sound of it, a heavy door on old hinges, closing on 2 innocent men, was the first debt this house owed her, and the first debt she let go unpaid. That was the first sting. It would not be forgotten, neither by the viewer nor by Tessa Voss, who wrote the date in her notebook that night with a hand that did not shake, though something in her chest did. The weeks folded into each other. Whitmore House ran on its rhythms. Breakfast at 8, correspondence at 10, the Duke's ledgers reviewed at noon by a cousin who had made himself indispensable to numbers. Julian was too trusting to check himself. Duke Julian Whitmore was 29, decent in the plain, unglamorous way that never gets remembered in society columns, and careless with trust the way a man is careless who has never been betrayed by anyone he loved. He signed what his cousin put in front of him. He laughed at his cousin's jokes. He called him Reg and clapped him on the shoulder, and never once imagined that the hand on his shoulder was measuring him for a fall. Lady Viola Cresswell arrived that summer on his arm, his fiancée, golden-haired, admired at every ball from York to London, engaged to a duke and delighted to say so. She was also, within 3 weeks, finding reasons to walk the East Corridor at the same hour Reginald Whitmore did. Tessa dusted the hall table outside the morning room and heard them before she saw them. "He bores me," Viola said, low, laughing under it. "Julian talks about drainage." "Drainage, Reginald." "At dinner. He talks about drainage because he actually cares whether his tenants flood," Reginald said, and there was an edge in it, something that almost sounded like contempt for his own cousin's decency. "Give him time. He'll bore himself into ruin without my help, and I'll simply be standing nearby when it happens." Viola laughed again, delighted, scandalous, thrilled with herself. "You're wicked. I'm accurate," Reginald said. "There's a difference, and it's the difference that makes men like me rich and men like Julian poor." Tessa's cloth did not stop moving on the table. Her face did not change, but the notebook against her ribs grew 1 line heavier that night. A date, a place, a name spoken too easily by a woman still wearing another man's ring. The engagement's collapse was being planned before the scandal had even begun. The viewer already knows this. Lady Viola Cresswell did not yet know she had said it out loud in front of the one person in the house who never forgot anything. Autumn came, and with it the forgery. It happened on a Tuesday night in October, in the library, with the fire not yet lit, and the room cold enough that Reginald kept his gloves on even at the desk. Tessa entered with the coal scuttle and knelt at the grate, and Reginald did not send her out. He never sent her out. Why would he? She was furniture. He had a stack of letters in front of him, business letters, contracts, a bank instruction, and beside them, a single genuine letter in Julian's own hand, borrowed from the estate office under some excuse about correspondence filing. He copied the signature, once, twice. He crumpled the paper and started again. "Damn it," he muttered, and tried a 3rd time. Tessa laid the kindling and did not look up. The fire caught, slow orange light, climbing the paper and the coal. Reginald practiced the signature 40 times that night. She counted silently, the way she counted everything now, because counting was a kind of speaking that nobody could stop her from doing. He read the fraudulent letters aloud as he wrote. The shipping contract that did not exist, the transfer of funds Julian had never approved, the instruction to the bank that would move £11,000 out of the Whitmore accounts and into a name that led, 3 steps removed, straight back to Reginald himself. He read them aloud for rhythm, for the music of Julian's voice on paper, a man building a lie, brick by brick, testing each brick with his own tongue before he mortared it into place. On the 40th signature, he held the page up to the firelight, admired it like a man admiring his own reflection, and turned to the maid kneeling at the grate. "Sounds like him, doesn't it?" he said, and laughed, low and pleased with himself. Go on, you can nod. I know you understand English, even if you can't speak it. Tessa Voss looked at the forged signature, looked at the fire, looked, for 1/2 of 1 second, at Reginald Whitmore's face. The smugness of it, the total certainty that nothing in this room could ever testify against him. She said nothing. She wrote it all down that same night, in the attic room she shared with no one, by a single candle, in the cipher only she could read. The date, the count of 40 signatures, the exact wording of 3 of the forged letters, and the mocking question that would come back to him a 1.5 years later in a courtroom full of the county's best families. Sounds like him, doesn't it? It did not sound like Julian. It sounded like Reginald. She knew it. She wrote it. And still she said nothing, and the viewer watching this story is right now asking the only question that matters. Why? Here is why. 12 years before Tessa Voss ever set foot in Whitmore House, she was a 14-year-old girl named Tessa Voss in a mill town in Lancashire, and her father worked as a bookkeeper for a magnate named Josiah Renfrew, a man who owned half the mills in the valley and every magistrate who mattered in it. Her father found the ledgers, 2 sets, one for the taxman, one for the truth. Wages skimmed from 300 workers. Year after year, a theft so large it had a name in the town, the Renfrew shortfall, though nobody dared say the name Renfrew out loud in connection with it, not where it could be heard. Her father was too honest to stay quiet and too poor to matter. He went to the magistrate. The magistrate was Renfrew's man. Her father was dismissed within the week for irregularities in his own accounts, a lie built from the very evidence he had tried to expose, turned inside out and used against him. There was a hearing, a small one, informal, in a cold room above the courthouse. 14-year-old Tessa Voss was called because she had seen the second ledger too, had helped her father copy pages by candlelight, believing, the way only a child can believe, that the truth, once spoken, simply wins. She stood up, she told the truth. Every word of it, clear and steady, in a voice her father was proud of even as his own case collapsed around them both. Josiah Renfrew's barrister tore her apart on cross-examination in 11 minutes, called her a coached child, called her father a bitter, failed man poisoning his own daughter against a pillar of the community. The magistrate, Renfrew's man, always Renfrew's man, dismissed the case before lunch. Her father lost his position, no reference, no new post anywhere in the valley, because Renfrew made one telephone call and closed every door in 3 counties. Her mother took in washing. Her younger brother left school at 11 to work. The family that had been merely poor became destroyed, brick by brick, in the 4 months after Tessa Voss told the truth in a cold room and believed it would matter. Josiah Renfrew never spent a night in a cell. He died 8 years later, rich, respected, a wing of the Lancashire hospital named after him. Tessa Voss did not speak again for 2 years. When she finally did, it was only ever in whispers, only ever to her mother, only ever in private. And by the time she was old enough to take a position in service, she had built silence into something stronger than a habit. She had built it into a wall, and the wall had a single rule carved into it, deeper than any cipher. I will never testify again. Truth did not save my father. It will not save anyone else. Let the world keep its secrets. I will only keep mine. So when the viewer assumed, watching Tessa Voss kneel silent at 40 forged signatures, that she was gathering her courage to save a good man, the viewer was wrong. She was not gathering courage. She was guarding a grave. The trial, when it came, was not her chance. It was her nightmare, walking toward her on 2 legs, wearing a duke's face this time instead of a bookkeeper's, and every instinct 14 years old and iron-hard told her the same thing it always had. Stay silent. Silence is armor. Silence is the only thing that never betrayed you. The story from here on is not the story of whether Tessa Voss would be heard. It is the story of whether she would choose, against everything her own ruined childhood had taught her, to speak. Winter came to Whitmore House, and with it, the first great public stage. The Whitmore Michaelmas dinner was the county's grandest fixture. 40 guests at a table set with the family silver, candles down its whole length, footmen in white gloves at every third chair. Julian sat at the head, Viola at his right hand in a gown the color of champagne, and Reginald 2 seats down, holding court with a story about a horse he had bought in Doncaster that made the whole table laugh. Tessa stood against the wall with the other maids. A tray of glasses balanced on one arm, invisible in the way only good service is meant to be invisible. Halfway through the second course, a guest, a banker's wife, tipsy on claret and careless with it, leaned toward Julian and said brightly, "Your cousin has been so wonderfully thorough with the estate accounts, Your Grace. My husband says he wishes his own man was half so diligent." "Reginald's a marvel with figures," Julian said, warm, proud, entirely unsuspecting. "I don't know what I'd do without him." Down the table, Reginald smiled into his wineglass. It was the smile of a man watching his own trap close, one polite compliment at a time, in front of 40 witnesses who would later swear, under oath, that Reginald Whitmore had always been trusted absolutely with the Duke's money. Tessa refilled a glass 2 seats from Reginald's elbow. She heard him murmur to the gentleman beside him, low, almost too low, "Diligent, yes, that's rather the word for it." He was laughing at his own crime, out loud, at his own cousin's table, and no one heard it but a maid nobody thought could repeat a word. That was the first public humiliation the title promised. Small, private within the grandeur, a man mocking his own victim to his face, while the victim smiled and poured more wine. The viewer's first small win of the night came an hour later, when the bribed bank clerk who had helped move Julian's forged funds appeared at the servants' entrance after midnight, demanding more money, hissing at Reginald in the scullery doorway where he thought no one could hear. "You said this was finished in December," the clerk snapped, his collar damp with fear-sweet, his hands shaking around his hat. "It is January. I want another £100 or I go to the magistrate myself." "You'll get your money," Reginald said, low, furious, glancing over his shoulder. "And you'll keep your mouth shut, or I'll swear you forged those instructions alone." Tessa Voss, carrying a stack of clean linens down the servants' passage, passed within 4 feet of that conversation and did not slow her step by a single inch. But that night, for the first time in 6 years, her hand shook a little as she wrote the date in her cipher. By early spring, the fraud broke open. It broke the way Reginald had built it to break. Cleanly, entirely, aimed at Julian's own throat. An anonymous letter reached the family solicitor, detailing £11,000 moved from the Whitmore accounts through a chain of shell instructions, every document bearing the Duke's own signature, verified. So the solicitor believed against Julian's known hand. Reginald wept when he heard the news. He wept beautifully, in front of the servants, in front of Viola, in front of the solicitor himself. "I cannot believe it of him," Reginald said, dabbing his eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. "I would have staked my life on Julian's honor. I am ruined with grief." Julian stood in his own study, staring at signatures that were not his but looked, to his own eyes, unnervingly like his, and said the only true thing anyone in that room said all day. "I did not write these. I have never seen these letters in my life." Nobody believed him. Not the solicitor. Not the magistrate summoned the next morning. Not within a week the county. Lady Viola Cresswell removed his ring from her finger at breakfast, in front of the household staff lined up for morning inspection, and set it on the table beside his teacup with a small, deliberate click. "I cannot marry a man under this kind of cloud, Julian," she said plainly, no tears in it at all, her voice carrying to every corner of the breakfast room. "My family has a name to protect, I am sure you understand. Viola." Julian's voice cracked on the single word. "I have done nothing." "Then the courts will say so," Viola said, already turning for the door, already reaching for Reginald's offered arm as if the motion had been rehearsed, which, of course, it had, in whispered corridors a full year before the scandal ever broke. Reginald has been such a comfort to me through this, such a comfort. The household staff lined up for inspection did not move, did not speak. Mrs. Binns's face went the color of ash. Tessa Voss stood at the end of the line with her hands folded in front of her apron, and inside her chest, where 6 years of silence had built its wall brick by brick, something shifted for the first time. Not enough to break the wall, not yet, but enough to crack it. 1 week later, at a garden party thrown by the Cresswell family to celebrate absolutely nothing that anyone would admit to celebrating, Lady Viola Cresswell arrived on Reginald Whitmore's arm, wearing the Whitmore betrothal ring on her right hand, turned so the crest caught the light every time she reached for a teacup. The county noticed. Of course, the county noticed. That was the entire point of wearing it. An older woman in a wide hat murmured to her companion, "Just loud enough to carry." Well, that didn't take long, did it? Poor Julian isn't even convicted yet. Reginald always did have an eye for advancement, the companion murmured back. I wonder how long he's had an eye on that particular ring. Small win for the viewer, second of the night. The county's whispers had begun to turn, one garden party at a time, even before a single piece of evidence had reached a courtroom. Reputation, once a weapon Reginald wielded so easily against 2 innocent footmen, was beginning, slowly, quietly, to point back at him. Before the arrest, there was one more stage, the grandest the county could offer. The Whitmore Hunt Ball, held every February in the Great Hall, 300 guests under chandeliers lit with real candles, an orchestra imported from London, and this year, everyone whispered, a very particular kind of drama on the guest list. Julian stood at the top of the great staircase to receive his guests, still unaware that the letters ruining him were already sealed in a solicitor's drawer, waiting for their moment. Reginald stood one step below him in a new coat, accepting compliments on his cousin's behalf with the easy grace of a man already rehearsing a eulogy for a career not yet dead. Viola arrived late on purpose, so the whole room would turn to watch her enter on Julian's arm. Though anyone watching closely that night would have seen her hand drift twice to Reginald's sleeve as she passed him in the receiving line, a small private touch dressed up as nothing at all. Tessa moved through the hall with a tray of champagne, unremarkable, unseen, the way she had trained herself to be unseen for 6 years. She heard Reginald tell a circle of gentlemen, glass raised, voice rich with wine and confidence, "My cousin is the finest man I know. I would defend his honor against any accusation, in any court in England." The gentlemen laughed and toasted him for his loyalty. Tessa refilled 2 glasses and moved on, and wrote the sentence down that same night, dated, because a man does not promise to defend an honor he is 3 months from destroying unless the promise itself is part of the performance. Later, near midnight, she passed the card room and heard Viola's voice through the half-open door, pitched low and thrilled. "When it breaks," Viola was saying, "and it will break, Reginald, promise me you won't wait a decent interval. I couldn't bear to wait." Reginald's answer was too quiet to catch in full, but Tessa caught 3 words of it before she moved on with her tray. "Soon, my darling." And those 3 words went into the notebook that night, beside a date the household ledgers would later confirm beyond argument. 6 weeks before the forgery was even discovered, a fiancé and a cousin were already planning the exact shape of the scandal that had not yet happened. That was the second humiliation the title promised. Not shouted across a room this time, but whispered behind a half-open door, and worse for its quiet, because it proved the cruelty was not a reaction to Julian's ruin. It was the plan that produced it. Julian Whitmore was arrested on the 14th of March, 1911, and charged with fraud in the amount of £11,000. He was permitted to remain at Whitmore House under a form of restricted parole until the assizes convened in York that spring, a small mercy that meant he spent his last weeks of freedom in the same house where the crime against him had been planned. in the same rooms where the true criminal still slept 2 doors down the corridor and dressed for dinner every night in borrowed innocence. Mrs. Harriet Binns, 61 years old, housekeeper of Whitmore House for 2 decades, had watched Reginald Whitmore's cruelty accumulate for 6 years without ever once being able to prove a single word of it. She had watched Tessa Voss the same 6 years, had hired her knowing full well the girl was not truly mute, had guessed the shape of her silence without ever asking its cause, had protected her from a dozen small dismissals over the years simply by standing between her and anyone who called her useless. One night in early April, 3 weeks before the trial, Mrs. Binns found Tessa in the attic room, the cipher notebook open on her narrow bed, 6 years of a household's secrets written in a code no living soul but Tessa Voss could read. "I don't know what that says," Mrs. Binns said quietly, standing in the doorway with a candle. "I've never asked. It was never mine to ask." Tessa closed the notebook and said nothing, because that was still, even now, the only answer she trusted. "His Grace is going to hang for another man's crime, Mrs." Binns went on, and her voice, usually iron, cracked on the word hang, though the sentence was legal death he faced, not the rope. The word simply came out of a housekeeper's fear, the way it comes out of every servant's fear when a master they respect stands at the edge of ruin. "Whatever's in that book of yours, Tessa, whatever you've written these 6 years. I think it's time someone who can read a courtroom had a look at it." Tessa looked at the notebook, looked at the woman who had protected her quietly, without ever once demanding an explanation for 6 years of silence. She did not speak. But 3 days later, she left the notebook on the small table by Mrs. Binns's door and did not take it back when she saw it gone the following morning. Mrs. Harriet Binns carried a book she could not read to a barrister she had never met and set it on his desk with hands that did not shake, because some debts, once you see how to pay them, become very easy to pay. Sir Nathaniel Quayle was 44 years old, sharp-eyed, and had lost more cases than he liked to admit in a career built on defending men's society had already decided to convict. When Mrs. Binns set the small leather notebook on his desk and explained, in 3 plain sentences, exactly who had written it and exactly what 6 years that Maid had spent, standing silent in rooms where guilty men spoke freely, Sir Nathaniel opened the notebook, looked at page after page of a cipher he could not begin to read, and felt something in his chest that he had not felt in 11 years of increasingly hopeless defense work. "Hope. Can she read it back?" he asked. "Every word." "She can read it," Mrs. Binns said. "Whether she'll speak it aloud in a courtroom full of the county, that, Sir Nathaniel, I cannot promise you. I don't believe anyone can promise you that, not even Tessa herself." Sir Nathaniel Quayle spent 2 evenings at Whitmore House, sitting across a small table from a maid who would not meet his eyes and would not speak a single word to him, sliding written questions across the table and watching her write brief, precise answers in plain English beneath them. The first proof, on paper if nowhere else, that the mute maid's silence had never once been an absence of a voice. It had only ever been a choice. On the second evening, he wrote a single question and slid it across the table and waited. "Miss Voss, I believe you have the evidence to save an innocent man. I believe you are also the only person in England who can deliver it. I will not force you to the stand. But I must ask you plainly, if you do not speak, who does?" Tessa Voss looked at the question for a long time. Long enough that the candle between them burned down half an inch. Long enough that Sir Nathaniel, a man not given to sentiment, found himself holding his own breath without meaning to. She picked up the pen. She wrote one word and turned the paper toward him, and it was the only word on the page, "Nobody." Then she set the pen down and stood and left the room, and Sir Nathaniel Quayle sat alone with a single word that told him everything and promised him nothing. The trial opened at the York Assizes on the 9th of May, 1911, before a gallery packed so tight that latecomers stood 3 deep along the back wall. Julian Whitmore, Duke of a name 400 years old, sat in the dock in a plain dark suit, his hands folded, his face the careful blank of a man who has decided that dignity is the only thing left to him that cannot be forged. The Crown's case took 4 days. It was, on its surface, devastating. The bank instructions, bearing Julian's signature, verified by 2 handwriting experts, who had never once been shown the 40 crumpled failed attempts that came before the 41st successful one. The shell company records, traced to a name that led, 3 careful steps, 3 careful cutouts. Nowhere near Reginald Whitmore's own signature, exactly as he had built it to lead nowhere. And then Reginald himself took the stand on the 4th day and testified with the polish of a man who had rehearsed his grief in mirrors. "I loved my cousin," Reginald said, voice trembling exactly enough, eyes wet exactly enough. "I still love him, in spite of everything. I brought this matter to the solicitor myself, gentlemen, because I could no longer in good conscience protect a man committing fraud under his own family's roof. It broke my heart to do it. It broke my heart." A murmur of sympathy ran through the gallery. Several women dabbed their eyes. Lady Viola Cresswell, seated in the front row of spectators beside her mother, nodded along with visible sorrow. The Whitmore betrothal ring turned discreetly inward on her finger, for the occasion, though everyone in the county had already seen it worn the other way. At the garden party 3 weeks before, on the 5th day, Viola herself was called and testified in a small, clear voice designed to sound reluctant that she had long suspected some instability in Julian's character and had felt it her duty to end the engagement the moment the scandal broke. "I did not switch my loyalties lightly," she told the court, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief that never once touched actual tears. "I acted only as any woman of conscience must act, when the man she loved proved himself capable of such deceit. Julian Whitmore, in the dock, said nothing because his barrister had told him to say nothing, and because there was, in truth, nothing left in his own defense that he knew how to say. Every document pointed at him. Every witness who mattered had turned. His own fiancée had called him unstable to a packed courtroom and worn his family's ring to a garden party while doing it. By the end of the 5th day, the smart money in every public house in York had Julian Whitmore convicted before the weekend, and Reginald Whitmore had begun, quietly, to accept congratulations on his composure under such a terrible family tragedy. That night, the small room behind the courtroom where the defense prepared, Sir Nathaniel Quayle laid the cipher notebook on the table in front of him and looked, for the 100th time, at pages he still could not read, and felt the whole case balanced on a single unanswered question. Would she come? Tessa Voss sat in the attic room at Whitmore House, with her cipher notebook gone from her hands for the first time in 6 years, and understood with total clarity what the next day would ask of her. Speak and risk becoming, again, the 14-year-old girl standing in a cold room while a barrister tore her voice into pieces and a magistrate dismissed her family's whole life before lunch. Or stay silent and watch an innocent man lose everything, the way her own father had lost everything, while the guilty man walked free and rich and admired, the way Josiah Renfrew had walked free and rich and admired for 8 more years before his heart, not his conscience, finally stopped. She thought of Danny Pratt and Owen Cole, dismissed on a lie she could have unmade with a single sentence, and had not. She thought of her father, telling the truth and losing everything for it, while the man who lied kept everything and more. 2 truths, both real, both hers, pulling in opposite directions with equal weight, and, somewhere near dawn, sitting alone by a window with the sky just beginning to gray over York, Tessa Voss finally understood the difference between them. Her father had told the truth to a magistrate who was already bought. He had spoken into a room built to silence him, in a system with no one left to protect him once he had spoken. She would not be speaking into that room. She would be speaking into a courtroom where Sir Nathaniel Quayle had already spent 2 nights sliding careful questions across a table, treating her not as furniture but as a witness, where Mrs. Harriet Binns had carried a notebook she could not even read across a county because she trusted, without proof, that it held the truth, where a decent man who had never once mocked her, never once called her a keyhole with hands, sat in a dock waiting for a voice that might be the only thing left standing between him and ruin. Her silence had once been armor. It had also, this same silence, let 2 innocent men walk out a door with no reference and no defense, because armor that protects only yourself, worn long enough, becomes something closer to a wall around a grave than a shield in a fight. At dawn, Tessa Voss stood, dressed, and walked down to Mrs. Binns's door before the housekeeper herself had risen, and knocked, and when Mrs. Binns opened it in her dressing gown, startled, Tessa looked at her, really looked at her, the way she had not let herself look at anyone in 12 years, and spoke her first words to another living soul in 6 years at Whitmore House. "I will go to York today," she said, her voice rough with disuse, cracking on the second word and steadying on the third. "I will speak." Mrs. Harriet Binns, 61 years old, iron-spined for 2 decades of service, stood in her own doorway and wept. The 6th day of the trial opened with the gallery packed tighter than any day before it, word having spread through York overnight that the defense intended some final, desperate gesture to save a duke everyone had already convicted in every drawing room in the county. Reginald Whitmore sat beside his own barrister, relaxed, almost bored, checking his gold watch twice in the first 10 minutes, certain the day held nothing but formalities before a verdict he had spent a year and a half building brick by brick, signature by signature, lie by rehearsed lie. Sir Nathaniel Quayle rose. The defense calls Miss Tessa Voss, and the courtroom did exactly what a courtroom full of people who had spent 6 years calling a young woman the mute would do when her name was called as the final witness in a duke's trial for his very freedom. They laughed. "The mute? He's calling the mute!" The words rang the same as they had at the very start of this story, because they were the same words, the same moment, the cold open now arriving at its true size, twice as loud, twice as public, the entire county's worst families packed into a courtroom instead of a servants' hall, laughing at a woman they had underestimated for 6 years without knowing they were building the exact stage on which that underestimation would detonate. Reginald laughed loudest of all. He turned in his seat to share the joke with his own barrister, delighted, careless, magnificent in his certainty that furniture could not testify. A bailiff called for order twice before the room quieted enough for Tessa Voss to rise from the servants' bench at the back, where she had been made to sit among the county's lowest witnesses, and walk the full length of the courtroom toward the stand. Her boots were the only sound in the room by the time she reached the 3rd row. Somewhere behind her, a woman whispered something unkind and was hushed by her own companion, curiosity beginning, already, to outpace cruelty. Tessa Voss climbed the 2 steps to the witness stand, laid one hand on the rail, lifted her chin, and looked for the first time in 6 years directly and fully into Reginald Whitmore's face. "My name is Tessa Voss," she said, clear, steady, a voice that carried to the very back wall where the latecomers stood 3 deep. "I have heard everything." The laughter died like a string cut clean. Reginald's smile did not move for a full second, the same frozen half-second the story promised at its very start, now stretched out, now watched by 300 people instead of a dozen, now the single instant on which every power relation in that room began silently to invert. The judge leaned forward. "Miss Voss, you have been sworn as a witness employed at Whitmore House for 6 years, in the capacity of housemaid." "Yes, my lord. And it has been the understanding of the household of this court, and indeed of the defense's own solicitor until 3 weeks ago, that you were unable to speak?" "I chose not to speak," Tessa said, and something in the way she said it, plain, unashamed, offering no apology for 12 years of silence to a courtroom that had never once earned an explanation, made the gallery lean forward as one body. I have not been unable to speak since I was 14 years old. I made a choice, and I have kept it until today. Sir Nathaniel Quayle stepped forward, the cipher notebook in his hand, and the questioning began. Miss Voss, on the night of the 14th of October last year, where were you employed? In the library at Whitmore House, laying the evening fire. And who else was present? Mr. Reginald Whitmore. What was he doing? Tessa Voss did not look at her notebook. 6 years of a cipher only she could read had already been transcribed, translated, checked twice against dates in the household ledgers by Sir Nathaniel himself over 3 sleepless nights. But she did not need the page in front of her, because she had lived every word of it once already, kneeling silent at a grate while a guilty man built his lie. He was practicing a signature, she said. Duke Julian's signature. He wrote it 40 times. I counted. A murmur ran through the gallery, the first of many, a sound that would grow with every sentence that followed, dying whispers and rising ones by turns, never the same sound twice, the whole room reacting like a single nervous animal. You counted 40 attempts, Sir Nathaniel repeated, for the jury, for the record, for the packed rows behind him. And what did Mr. Whitmore do with the pages that failed? He burned them in the grate I had just laid, Tessa said. I watched them burn, and the letters he was forging, did he read them aloud as he worked? Yes. Can you recall their content? Tessa Voss recited, word for word, the shipping contract that did not exist. Word for word, the bank instruction transferring £11,000 through a chain of shell companies that led, 3 careful steps later, to an account controlled, though never in a name that could be easily traced, by Reginald Whitmore himself. She recited dates. She recited the exact wording of a sentence Reginald had rewritten 4 times to make it sound more like Julian's own careful phrasing, testing each version aloud against the crackle of a fire she had lit with her own hands. A woman in the second row of the gallery fainted, quietly, and had to be helped out by 2 others, and the disturbance did not slow Tessa Voss for even a single sentence. How can this court be certain, the prosecuting barrister interrupted, rising sharply, that this maid did not simply memorize the contents of documents she had access to at some later date and construct this account entirely after the fact, at the defense's instruction? Because I wrote it down the same night, Tessa said. And for the first time, she looked down at the small leather notebook Sir Nathaniel now held, and something like the ghost of a smile crossed her face. Not warm, not soft, something harder and more satisfying than either. In a cipher of my own making, every entry dated, every entry witnessed by my own hand within hours of the event it describes. Sir Nathaniel has had it verified by a cryptographer at the university these past 3 weeks. The dates in my notebook match the dates in the household's own ledgers, the fires I laid, the rooms I cleaned, the exact evenings Mr. Whitmore is recorded as having been at Whitmore House and nowhere else. The prosecuting barrister sat down, slowly, without another question ready. Reginald Whitmore's face had gone the color of old paper. His hand, resting on the rail in front of him, had begun, visibly, to the entire gallery, to tremble, a small fine tremor he could not still no matter how hard he pressed his fingers flat against the wood. Sir Nathaniel Quayle let the silence sit for 3 full seconds before his final question, and when he asked it, his voice had dropped, quiet and precise, so that every soul in that packed courtroom had to lean in to hear it. Miss Voss, on the night in question, did Mr. Whitmore say anything directly to you regarding the forgery he had just completed? Tessa Voss turned her head slowly and looked at Reginald Whitmore across the full width of the courtroom, and this time she did not look away. He held up the 40th signature, she said, and he asked me a question. He asked, "Sounds like him, doesn't it?" And then he laughed because he did not think I could answer him. She let that sit for one breath. Then she gave him the answer, 12 years overdue, in front of the largest crowd Whitmore House or York had ever gathered against him. It did not sound like him, sir. It sounded like you. The courtroom did not merely gasp, it rose. Not all at once, but in a wave. Chairs scraping, whispers breaking into open exclamations, a bailiff shouting for order that no one obeyed for a full 10 seconds, the sound of 300 people discovering, in the same instant, that the county's most trusted gentleman was a forger and that the county's most mocked servant had just handed him a sentence of his own making, verbatim, before the very witnesses he had spent a year and a half performing for. The judge's gavel cracked down 3 times before the room settled. "Mr. Whitmore," the judge said, and his voice, when it finally cut through, had gone cold in a way it had not been cold for the entire 6 days of trial. "You will remain at the rail. Bailiff, you will ensure Mr. Whitmore does not leave this courtroom." Reginald Whitmore stood, and the arrogance that had carried him through 6 years of Whitmore House, through a stolen wine cellar and 40 forged signatures, and a fiancée stolen out from under his own cousin's dismissed ring. All of it drained out of his face in front of the largest crowd he had ever wanted to impress, and what was left underneath it was something small and gray and frightened, a man watching everything he had built collapse in the space of a single testimony. "This is absurd," he managed, but his voice cracked on the word, and no one in the gallery believed him, because they had all just watched him tremble at a rail while a maid recited his own crimes back to him in his own words. Sir Nathaniel Quayle was not finished. He turned to the judge and requested that a further section of Miss Voss's notebook be entered into the record, dated entries, verified against household correspondence, detailing conversations between Mr. Reginald Whitmore and Lady Viola Cresswell across the preceding 18 months, in which the collapse of Lady Viola's engagement to Duke Julian Whitmore had been discussed, planned, and anticipated by both parties in language that made clear the switch of loyalty had been arranged long before any scandal gave it a respectable excuse. Lady Viola Cresswell, seated in the front row beside her mother, went white as the notebook's contents were read aloud. "Dates, corridors, the exact words he bores me, and I'll simply be standing nearby when it happens." Spoken a full year before she had ever claimed, under oath, to have long suspected some instability in Julian's character. Her mother's hand flew to her own mouth. Somewhere in the gallery, a voice, female, delighted, merciless in the particular way only society can be merciless toward its own, said clearly enough to carry. "She's worn his ring to a garden party. I said as much myself. Didn't I say as much?" Viola Cresswell did not testify again. She did not need to. The record spoke for her in her own recorded words, before exactly the society she had switched sides to impress, and the crest on the ring she had turned inward that morning for the occasion of her own testimony was, by that afternoon, the subject of open scorn in every drawing room from York to London. The judge called a recess. When the court reconvened 2 hours later, the Crown's own prosecutor rose unprompted and requested leave to withdraw the charges against Duke Julian Whitmore entirely, in light of evidence that had, in his own words, entirely reversed the material facts of this case. The judge granted it without hesitation. "Duke Julian Whitmore," the judge said, "you are discharged. This court finds no case to answer, and further finds that the evidence now before it points overwhelmingly toward the guilt of Mr. Reginald Whitmore in the matter of forgery, fraud, and the deliberate framing of an innocent man. Mr. Whitmore, you will remain in custody pending formal charge." 2 constables took Reginald Whitmore by each arm at the rail, the same rail he had leaned on so easily 6 days before, joking with his own barrister, and led him out of the courtroom he had entered as a gentleman and left as a man in custody, past 300 witnesses who had laughed with him a week earlier and now watched him in a silence far heavier than any laughter could have been. Julian Whitmore stood in the dock, free, and looked across the courtroom at the Maid who had just spoken for the first time in 6 years, in front of the largest crowd either of them had ever stood before, and understood with total clarity exactly what she had just given up to save him. Every ounce of the silence she had spent 12 years building into a wall, spent now entirely on his behalf. He crossed the courtroom floor and stopped in front of the witness stand, and did not know for a moment what a duke says to the woman who has just saved his whole life with a voice everyone had told her she did not have. "Miss Voss," he said finally, and his own voice was not steady either. "Thank you does not begin to cover this. Ask me for anything. Anything at all that is mine to give, it is yours." The gallery, still settling from the shock of Reginald's removal, quieted again to hear her answer. Tessa Voss did not ask for money, though Reginald Whitmore's seized accounts held far more than enough to make her wealthy for the rest of her life. She did not ask for a title or a cottage or a pension, though any of these would have been granted within the hour. "Danny Pratt and Owen Cole," she said. "2 footmen, dismissed 6 years ago for a theft Mr. Whitmore himself committed. I have their names, their last known addresses, and the date and hour they were wrongly turned out of your house. I would ask that they be found, publicly named innocent, and compensated from the very accounts that ruined them." Julian Whitmore's throat worked once before he answered. "Consider it done, today, publicly, and in full." Within the month it was. Reginald Whitmore was tried and convicted on charges of forgery and fraud, stripped of every allowance the Whitmore estate had ever granted him, and sentenced to a term in prison that ended, permanently, his welcome in every drawing room, club, and county gathering that had once laughed along with his jokes at the mute's expense. His name, once spoken with easy trust across York society, became instead the name attached, forever after, to the single most talked about scandal the county had seen in a decade. A man undone by everything that had passed, unnoticed, through a keyhole he himself had called her. Lady Viola Cresswell's engagement to the Whitmore name ended in public record rather than private heartbreak, her own recorded words read into a courtroom transcript that every society paper in the north of England quoted within the week. She left York that summer for an aunt's house in Bath, and the betrothal ring she had once worn, turned outward to a garden party, catching the light on purpose, was returned to the Whitmore estate by her own solicitor, without comment, because there was, by then, nothing left worth saying. Danny Pratt was found working as a stable hand 2 counties away, half his old wages, no reference to his name for 6 years running. Owen Cole was found in Leeds, unemployed for the 3rd time that year, his family thin with the cost of it. Both men were brought back to Whitmore House within a fortnight, publicly named innocent before the assembled staff in the very hall where they had once been dismissed, and paid, from Reginald Whitmore's seized accounts, 6 years of lost wages in full, with an apology from the Duke himself that every servant in that hall would repeat, with satisfaction for years afterward. Tessa Voss remained at Whitmore House, but not as a maid. Julian Whitmore, within the same month, made her his household's private secretary, the keeper, at his own insistence, of every record and every ledger the estate produced, the one voice in the house he trusted absolutely, because she had proven, in the most public way imaginable, exactly what her silence had really been guarding all along. She kept the cipher notebook. She never needed it the same way again. Her voice, once returned, did not leave her. She spoke at breakfast. She spoke in the village. She spoke eventually and carefully to a young solicitor's clerk named Peter Ashworth, who called on Whitmore House twice as often as his work strictly required, and who never once, in 3 years of careful courtship, called her anything but Tessa. Mrs. Harriet Binns kept her post as housekeeper for another decade, and told the story of the notebook she could not read to every new maid who joined the household, always ending it the same way. Never mistake quiet for empty, girl. The quietest room in this house heard everything that ever mattered in it. Every great house has someone it treats as furniture, a maid who does not speak, a footman no one looks at twice, a quiet clerk in the corner of an office, taking notes no one thinks to fear. The furniture remembers. Think of the quietest person in your own life tonight, the one who says the least at the table, who stands nearest the door, who has learned, for reasons you may never know, that silence is safer than a voice. Think about what they may have heard and what it might cost them one day to finally say it out loud. Silence is not emptiness, it is storage, and every room that fills it eventually learns what it was keeping. Here is the question this story leaves you with, and there is no easy answer to it. Tessa Voss stayed silent while two innocent men lost everything, because the one time she had spoken the truth before, it destroyed her family and let a guilty man walk free. Can you truly blame her for that silence? And if you had watched what speaking once cost her, would you have spoken sooner than she did? Or would you, too, have waited for a courtroom that finally deserved to hear you? This is Dukes and Duchesses, where every story is told the way it deserves to be told. Subscribe now, share this with someone today, and tell us in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. We will see you for the next story. It is already waiting.